Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 10th annual summer seminar and our very first ever virtual seminar. It's a joy already in these first few minutes to be with you. The chat box has been full of greetings from friends of the Hildebrand Project, those of you who have attended seminars with us in the past, those of you who are friends of ours through our publications and other online events, and it's just a joy to see all of your names coming through. You all are literally, quite literally everywhere in the world. We have people from all over the United States and Latin America, from Europe. We have friends from Australia with us. I see we even have a friend from Nazareth. So we are truly gathering in a global way, and it's just a joy to be with you all. I apologize for the brief delay this morning, but I think we should be good to go at this point. I'll keep my opening remarks very brief because our first speaker will say something about the purpose of our seminar. But let me just say that over the next 5 days and over the next 17 different panel presentations and discussions, we will explore the heart in all different aspects, in philosophical and theological terms, in psychological terms, in practical terms. We'll look at very applied questions that arise when we think about the heart. We'll be looking at gender and the heart. We'll be looking at the heart in a time of pandemic. And we'll also be looking at alongside our reading of Hildebrand. In a particular way, we will be introducing our participants to the thought of Van Hildebrand on the heart, but we will also be reading him in dialogue with St. Thomas Aquinas and with many recent masters, notably Karol Wojtyła and St. Edith Stein and others. So I think you can look forward to a wonderful gathering and intellectual conversation. I should note that we have a much larger number of you participating virtually than we ever have here in person when we gather. We typically have 50 or 70 participants, but in the case of this virtual seminar, we have nearly 1,500 registered attendees and friends with us. So we will do our best throughout the seminar to break down this large group into smaller units through the questions. During each presentation, you will have a chance to, of course, listen to the speaker or speakers. We ask you to submit your questions through the question and the Q&A function in Zoom. Please do not submit them through chat. Chat is there for you all to speak to each other, but we will be looking to the Q&A function for questions in an effort to try to manage that. We will try to go through as many of them as possible. We ask for your understanding if we do not cover your particular question. We'll look obviously for common themes among questions. So please, but please join us as actively as you can through your questions. And the format will be that since there are so many of you, it's not possible for you to come on screen, but what I will do is I will read the questions to this morning's presenters, and then they will answer them for the group. Let me just say the briefest of words of introduction for our first speaker, Professor John Crosby. I think most of you all probably realize that there is some relationship between him and myself. Professor Crosby was a student of Dietrich von Hildebrand and studied with him in the latter years of von Hildebrand's life, had him not only as a philosophical master and mentor, but also as a friend. My father also had the opportunity to teach at the John Paul II Institute in Rome for a period of about 10 years, and as a member of the guest faculty. And there he had many profound intellectual encounters with John Paul II, who became, in a way, a very significant mentor as well. This morning we will hear from Professor Crosby, not on these topics per se, but on another great inspiration of his, namely on the thought of John Henry Newman. I should briefly acknowledge also that Professor Crosby is not only a professor of philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville, but also a co-founder of the Hildebrand Project and senior fellow with the Hildebrand Project. So it's my pleasure to present to you Professor Crosby, and then we will resume with questions a little later in the session. Thank you very much.
Good.
Professor Crosby, you are up.
All right. Thank you, John Henry, and good morning to all of you, at least to all of you in the Americas. Good afternoon. Good evening to those of you farther east. It's wonderful to be gathered together like this on this 10th annual summer seminar. I can't help but go back to the first summer seminar in the basement of a church in Arlington, Virginia. We started out on a modest scale, and here, 10 years later, we're holding the seminar on a global scale. So let me just first say a word about the focus of this year's summer seminar, the focus on the theme of the heart in Dietrich von Hildebrand. This theme is certainly one of the central themes of von Hildebrand. And not only that, it is one of the most original parts of his philosophy. And not only that, his thought on the heart is one of the most nourishing parts of his philosophy. For all of these reasons, we decided to center this year's summer seminar around the theme of the heart. Now, von Hildebrand frames his thought on the heart like this. He speaks of rehabilitating the human heart. This implies that the heart has been neglected and underrated in our philosophical tradition. In thinking about the human person, most philosophers have laid stress on the rationality that distinguishes us from the animals, and they have explicated rationality in terms of intellect and will. As for the affective life, the feeling life of persons, that is, the heart, most philosophers have thought that this occupies a lower place in our nature than intellect and will. Feelings are notoriously erratic, unstable, subjective in the negative sense of that term. They're rooted in the body. They have to be governed by intellect and will and are therefore subordinate to intellect and will. Now, von Hildebrand comes forth with an extraordinary challenge to our philosophical tradition, saying that the heart is in fact the equal of intellect and will. He says that if we want to do justice to man as rational being, as person, we have to acknowledge not two, but three centers of personal or spiritual life: the intellect, the will, and the heart. Let me unpack that just a little with an example. Go back to the Good Samaritan, that story well known from the Gospel. The Good Samaritan approaches the injured person, and he understands with his intellect the right thing to do, and he commits himself with his will to doing it. But suppose that he feels no compassion for the injured man. Suppose he acts out of a sense of duty, but that his heart is not in the helping. There is a tremendous difference between a Samaritan who helps only out of duty and the Good Samaritan who is also moved by compassion. The Good Samaritan is morally better because of his compassion. Only he embodies love of neighbor through that compassion. And there's something else. Only the Good Samaritan is fully present to the injured man. The Samaritan who acts just out of duty is holding something back from the injured man. He acts in such a way as not to be in the act of helping with his whole being. This so significant with his whole being is the contribution of heartfelt compassion. This is why von Hildebrand speaks of the heart as the real self of the person. Now, this is as far as I want to take the thought of von Hildebrand right now. The other presenters in the seminar will unpack it further. I want now to turn to a predecessor of Newman, to the great St. John Henry Newman, who already in the 19th century inaugurated a rehabilitation of the heart. Perhaps many of you know Newman's motto as cardinal, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. I think we will understand von Hildebrand all the better by understanding how Newman anticipated him. There are profound points of affinity between von Hildebrand and Newman. I've explored some of them in my book, The Personalism of John Henry Newman, and now I want to explore some more of them with you. Let us turn to Newman's great sermon, The Thought of God, the Stay of the Soul, in which he explores with Augustinian grandeur the happiness for which we are made. Newman says, and I quote, "The happiness of the soul consists in the exercise of the affections, not in sensual pleasures, not in activity, not in excitement, not in self-esteem, not in the consciousness of power, not in knowledge. In none of these things lies our happiness, but in our affections being elicited, employed, supplied. When they are exercised, the soul is happy. When they are undeveloped, restrained, or thwarted, it is not happy. This," Newman continues, "is our real and true bliss, not to know or to pursue, but to love, to hope, to joy, to admire, to revere, to adore. Our real and true bliss lies in the possession of those objects on which our hearts may rest and be satisfied." End of that quote. Newman is, of course, well aware that what we know and what we will has much to do with our happiness, but he makes a point of saying that our happiness is in the first place something affective, something situated in the heart. In his book on the heart, von Hildebrand says the same thing. Happiness, he says, is nothing if not felt. It is achieved not just in the intellect and the will, but most of all in the heart. Now, in that same sermon, Newman considers what happens to a person in whom the heart is restrained and thwarted. He writes, and I quote, "What a truly wretched state is that coldness and dryness of soul in which so many live and die, high and low, learned and unlearned." And a little further down he continues, "You see the educated man, full of thought, full of intelligence, full of action, but still with a stone heart, cold and dead as regard his affections." End of that quote. Newman is referring to what von Hildebrand calls the atrophy of the heart. Both thinkers help us see the importance of the heart by showing us the misery of a heart constrained and thwarted and atrophied. And there is one more thought I want to take from this sermon of Newman's. Philosophers have long pointed out a certain infinity proper to the intellect. This infinity shows up in our striving always to surpass the knowledge that we have, and never to be satisfied with the knowledge we have attained. And philosophers have pointed out the same infinity with respect to the will restlessly always aiming at more. Well, Newman discerns the same infinity with respect to the heart. And he says, and I quote, "Created natures cannot open us or elicit the 10,000 mental senses which belong to us and through which we really live. None but the presence of our Maker can enter us, for to none besides can the whole heart in all its thoughts and feelings be unlocked and subjected. And then Newman goes on to say, if it be not overbold to say it, he who is infinite can alone be the measure of the human heart. He alone can answer to the mysterious assemblage of feelings and thoughts which it has within it. End of that quote. Thus, the infinity of aspiration is not reserved for the intellect and will, as if the heart were something bodily and entirely finite. No, infinity is found no less in the heart. Or let us put it like this. It's often said that as persons we exist as capax Dei, capable of God. Now, this mysterious capacity that connects us with God shows up just as much in the aspirations of the heart as it does in the stirrings of the intellect and the will. So much for that great sermon of Newman's as a thought of his thought on the heart. I turn now to a fundamental distinction that runs throughout the thought of Newman, the distinction between notional and real assent. And I want to show how it is that real assent involves the heart. So let's first explain the distinction so central to Newman. Take the true proposition that I will one day die. To assent to it notionally is to assent to it on the grounds that all living beings die, myself included. This notional assent is a strongly intellectual assent, and it has little power to move me or to agitate me. For with notional assent, I experience my future death as if I were a mere spectator of it. But now suppose that I have just gotten an ominous test result from my physician. Aggressive, inoperable cancer. I know that I will soon die. My coming death is no longer abstract, but pierces me, as Newman says, with its concreteness. My assent turns from notional to real. I experience myself not just as a logical part of everyone, but almost as if I were the only human being. I experience my death not just as something common to me and all living beings, but as something supremely concerning me personally. Newman wants to say that I get closer to the truth about my death when I move from giving a mere notional assent to it and start giving a real assent to it. Now, Newman took particular interest in the transition from notional to real as it occurs in religion. He teaches that the mere notional assent to the being of God is not enough. He aspired to the abundant life of a real assent to the being of God. Consider this powerful sentence of Newman's. It's so powerful and significant and so quintessentially Newman that I used it as the motto of my book on Newman. He says, I am far from denying the real force of the arguments in proof of a God, but these do not warm me or enlighten me. They do not take away the winter of my desolation or make the buds unfold and the leaves grow within me and my moral being rejoice. End of that quote. So when he speaks of the arguments in proof of a God, he's speaking of mere notional assent to the existence of God, whereas the assent to God that warms and enlightens him and takes away the winter of his desolation is a real assent. He thought that a relation to God mediated mainly by notional assent was too abstract and left God at too great a distance. And he thought that the real assent to God involved something much better, namely a living personal encounter with him. If you know Newman, you know that he had a rare gift for converting notional to real assents. This gift goes far towards explaining the power of his sermons. Well, to our theme of the heart, you see the connection. It is apparent that notional assent engages mainly the intellect, and that real assent engages mainly the heart. When Newman expresses his longing for a path to God that makes the buds unfold and the leaves grow within me, and my moral being rejoice, he is longing for an affectively rich path to God. He cultivates real assent in religion because it, in contrast to mere notional assent, has the power to touch the heart, and so to motivate a person to a deep religious commitment. Von Hildebrand would say it like this: while notional assent engages just one side of the person, namely the intellect, real assent engages the whole person. A person who lives mainly by notional assent is a victim of affective atrophy, of a withered heart, and he loses contact with his real self. In this way, von Hildebrand captures in his own language what we've just brought to light in Newman. Now, Newman is also aware of various pathologies of the heart. Consider this poem of Newman's entitled Flowers Without Fruit. And as you'll see, it deals not so much with the affective atrophy mentioned above, but with the opposite affective pathology, what von Hildebrand calls affective hypertrophy, or a certain affective excess. So the poem of Newman's Flowers Without Fruit goes like this: prune thou thy words, the thoughts control that o'er thee swell and throng. They will condense within thy soul and change to purpose strong. But he who lets his feelings run in soft, luxurious flow shrinks when hard service must be done and faints at every woe. Faith's meanest deed more favor bears where hearts and wills are weighed than brightest transport, choicest prayers, which bloom their hour and fade. Now, this poem may at first surprise us because Newman seems to be singing the praises of the affectively dead will and to be warning against strong affections as if they were just a thing of soft, luxurious flow and hence a hindrance to a resolute will. But in reality, Newman is not withdrawing here any of his appreciation of the heart. For he has in mind the case where strong feelings should lead on to action. Suppose I have great compassion for a needy person, and suppose I'm in a position to help that person. Surely my compassion is not genuine if it does not lead to some helping action toward the needy person. But it happens all the time that my compassion spends itself as a feeling while I remain idle and find excuses for not acting. My compassion in that case replaces action rather than leads to it. This is the case of flowers without fruit, censured by Newman. He is not censuring the feeling of compassion as such, but only the compassion which fails to bear its fruit of active help. He also censures a helping action that is devoid of the feeling of compassion, which he might have labeled fruit without flowers. Now, there is something else that Newman rebukes in the affective life of believers. In this rebuke, he brings to light one of the most important and fundamental structures of the heart. I'm thinking of the way in which Newman rebukes the, as he called them, evangelical Christians of his day for trying to stir up their religious feelings by acting directly on them. He explains himself in this well-known passage. The true preaching of the gospel is to preach Christ. But the fashion of the day has been, instead of this, to preach conversion, to attempt to convert by insisting on conversion, to exhort men to undergo a change, to tell them to be sure they look at Christ, instead of simply holding up Christ to them, to tell them to have faith rather than to supply its object, to lead them to stir up and work up their minds, instead of impressing on them the thought of him who can savingly work in them. And thus faith and what is called spiritual mindedness are dwelt on as ends and obstruct the view of Christ. And of that quote, Newman's idea is that you awaken a religious feeling, and indeed any properly personal feeling, whether religious or not by focusing directly on the feeling, but by focusing on the motivating object of the feeling. Newman is simply taking account of what Shaler and von Hildebrand will later call the intentionality of personal feeling, which means that personal feeling is not caused by some force in nature, but is instead motivated by some object that is understood by the person having the feeling. This means that we practice a certain self-forgetfulness in our personal feelings, since in having the feelings, we are directed to their objects and not to the feelings themselves. Newman says, I quote him once more, men who are acted upon by news, good or bad, or sights beautiful or fearful, admire, rejoice, weep, or are pained. But they are moved spontaneously, not with a direct consciousness of their emotion. So it is with faith and other Christian graces. Bystanders see our minds, but our minds, if healthy, see the object which possesses them. And Newman completes the thought like this: as God's grace elicits our faith, so his holiness stirs up our fear, and his glory kindles our love. Others may say of us, here is faith, there is conscientiousness, and there is love. But we can only say, this is God's grace, that is his holiness, and that is his glory. End of that quote. Well, to sum up Newman's rehabilitation of the heart, let me just review the main points we've covered. Newman understood the affective nature of happiness. He understood the misery of an atrophied heart, an effectively dead heart. He understood the infinite capacity of the human heart. We've also seen that he warns against a barren intellectualism that comes from over-reliance on notional assent. And he explains why the deeper and more important thing of real assent is an achievement of the heart. In addition, we have seen that Newman warns against affective excess. And he does so not by way of depreciating affectivity, but by protecting it against an unseemly softness. Finally, we have seen how Newman understood the fundamental structure of intentionality, which distinguishes properly personal affective life from subpersonal affective life. I think then that we will understand von Hildebrand's rehabilitation of the heart all the better if we begin our seminar reflecting on the remarkable ways in which St. John Henry Newman anticipated von Hildebrand. Thank you for your attention. And now, John Henry, not terribly much time remains for questions, but maybe we can take a few still.
Yes, we certainly can. And I'm sorry to you and to the audience that the time is abbreviated. We had a bit of a slow start this morning, our first time broadcasting to such a large group on Zoom, and I'll do my best here to summarize some of the questions that have been put to you. So one question that is more historical in nature, and I'll just pose that for you to comment on briefly, Professor Crosby, is simply this: why do you think philosophers neglected to address the rehabilitation of the heart, in the history of philosophy? Not in every respect, but why has been why did that happen, and what prompted the thinkers of the 20th century, like Hildebrand, Wojtyła, Newman before him, to take on the project of the heart's redemption?
Well, perhaps von Hildebrand would say in response to that question that the heart was seen too much in the light of lower things. It was seen too much in the light of its excesses, in the light of what Newman calls the soft, luxurious flow of feelings that render us inert for acting. And so the heart was seen in the light of its deformities, of its excesses, of its disorders. And it was the achievement of Newman, von Hildebrand, Scheler, and many others to discriminate between these excesses and the real thing, the heart according to its true destiny in the human person. So that would be a very short and a very partial answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. There are quite a number of questions that touch on the very structure of the emotions. How do the emotions function? What does Newman, what does von Hildebrand, what do other thinkers hold on the way in which the emotions function, also in relation to the will? And I'll just say for the moment that most of these questions, if not all of them, will be addressed in subsequent sessions throughout the seminar. So I'd like to take just another question that appears here in a couple of versions here, where the question is essentially, what would von Hildebrand say to those who are, in the case of a saint like Saint Teresa, a depth of affective atrophy and dryness. And then there's also a question about this type of affective dryness in the case of mental illness, like depression. What do you think Newman would say in cases where this abundance of the affective life is maybe blocked in a more significant way?
Yes, right. Well, let me take those 2 points in order. And so the first one, again, John Henry, is?
Well, the question essentially concerns emotional atrophy or emotional dryness.
Right,
in the case of the saints, of course, there may be supernatural reasons they're given in part, but how does one make sense of that? And then the further case that might be in the form of depression.
Of the saints and that the spiritual dryness that often afflicted them and tormented them. But, the fact that that was a cross implies that it's not the natural order of the human person to be affectively deprived. The nature of the cross presupposes that a fully flourishing person has a fully flourishing heart. Uh, and the dryness is an affliction just because something proper to the person is withdrawn. And so you find the saints often, and in fact, in the liturgy of the Catholic Church, there's a votive mass for the gift of tears. So they have often sought this heartfelt sense of their sins, heartfelt repentance, leading to tears, as if that were a special gift to be able to feel deeply one's repentance, not just know it abstractly and draw the consequences with the will, but to feel the repentance deeply. That always prized as special in grace. And the effect of dryness is always acknowledged to be a burden, a cross, something to be borne in faith, but certainly no part of our life in eternity, no part of the final glory that we hope to live in. That will be a life led in full, effective abundance. Now, as for persons, deprived effectively, maybe not for a spiritual reason, but for more of a psychological reason. Again, that in a way presupposes everything that Newman and Hildebrand want to say about the heart, because it's a deprivation, this not being able to feel. And therefore, it's a cross, even though it may have the character of a psychological brokenness in the person. But, the same thing is true of the intellect and will. There are times when the intellect is darkened and confused and beset with confusion. And just as that doesn't make us turn against the intellect as a fundamental power of the person, so the capacity of the heart to be beset with darkness and confusion doesn't tell against its legitimate, noble place in the life of a person.
There are so many good questions here, and I hope that the subsequent sessions will answer them, if not all in relation to Newman, certainly in terms of the substance of the questions being asked, many of which have to do with the relationship of the heart and the will and the intellect. Also, the question of actions that people perform. Maybe we can make this the last question. I'm sure Newman would not hold that that acting out of duty when necessary, when there is a complete spiritual dryness or an effective dryness, is not still called for and quite noble.
Right.
So this desire for a full emotional life.
That's right. He doesn't say, "Oh, you're dispensed of your duty if you don't feel strongly in the fulfillment of it." No, it may be the best we can do is to act out of duty, and then, of course, that's exactly what we should do, and that would be even the way back to a revival of a normal, effective life. The thought is simply that there's a fullness of the human being alive when the heart is throbbing and alive, and that the ideal for which we strive is that throbbing heart work together with a committed will. And we take it as a regrettable substandard situation where we want to feel with the heart but can't. The feeling is blocked, the grief is blocked for some reason. And the best we can do is to do the right thing by our choices.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are unfortunately at the end of our time. There are many questions that seek citations to works that you've mentioned in the text, and perhaps we can find a way to share some of those references in a subsequent manner. Not quite sure how we'll do that, but I'm sure we can. Also, for those of you who...
All of the quotes from Newman, I might just add, are in my book on the personalism of John Henry Newman. Those and other related quotes on the heart can be.
Okay. Yes. And for those of you who joined us late or were forced to join us late as we had a delay with Zoom allowing all of you in to the session, Those of you who'd like to watch the full video can do so by visiting our Facebook page. We've been streaming live to Facebook as well, and the video will be archived there. And later this summer, a more fully produced version of the whole seminar will go onto the Hildebrand Project's YouTube channel, where you can also see it at that time. But for the time being, if you want to be able to see complete presentations, if you've missed a portion or you want to see something again, please visit our Facebook page. Well, Professor Crosby, thank you very much. I don't know how to ask for a round of applause, but I know they're all cheering. Let me just ask everyone to stay where you are. We're going to take just a break of about 5 minutes as we bring up our next set of presenters. So please stay where you are, and we look forward to seeing you in just a few minutes. Thank you again, Professor Crosby.
Yeah. Thank you all for listening from the four corners of the globe. Thank you.